is History by Derek Walcott. An analysis done by Sarai Andrews. Introduction. Who was he? Derek Wolcott was a West Indian poet from Castries, St. Lucia. He taught at several schools in St. Lucia and Grenada, and at Boston University in America. He won the Nobel Prize in 1992, and until the time of his death had published an estimated 30 plays. The sea is history. Where are your monuments, your battles, martyrs? Where is your tribal memory? Sirs, in that grey vault, the sea. The sea has locked them up. The sea is history. First, there was the heaving oil, heavy as chaos. Then, like a light at the end of a tunnel, the lantern of a caravel. And that was Genesis. Then there were the packed cries, the shit, the moaning. Exodus, bone soldered by coral to bone, mosaics mantled by the benediction of the shark's shadow. That was the Ark of the Covenant. Then came from the plucked wires of sunlight on the seafloor, the plangent harp of the Babylonian bondage, as the white cowries clustered like manacles on the drowned woman, and those were the ivory bracelets of the Song of Solomon. But the ocean kept turning blank pages, looking for history. Then came the men with eyes heavy as anchors, who sank without tombs. Brigands who barbecued cattle, leaving their charred ribs like palm leaves on the shore. Then the foaming, rabid maw of the tidal waves swallowing Port Royal. And that was Jonah. But where is your Renaissance? Sir, it is locked in them sea sands, out there past the reef's moiling shelf, where the men of war floated down. Strap on these goggles, I'll guide you there myself. It's all subtle and submarine, through colonnades of coral. Past the Gothic windows of sea fans, to where the crusty grouper, onyx-eyed, blinks, weighted by its jewels like a bald queen. And these groined caves with barnacles pitted like stone are our cathedrals. And the furnace before the hurricanes, Gomorrah. Bones ground by windmills into marl and cornmeal. And that was Lamentations. That was just Lamentations. It was not history. Then came, like scum on the river's drying lip, the brown reeds of villages, mantling and congealing into towns. And at evening the midges' choirs, and above them the spires lancing the side of God, as the sun set, and that was the New Testament. Then came the white sisters clapping to the waves' progress, and that was emancipation. Jubilation, oh jubilation, vanishing swiftly, as the sea's lace dries in the sun. But that was not history. That was only faith. And then each rock broke into its own nation. Then came the synod of flies. Then came the secretarial heron. Then came the bullfrog, bellowing for a vote. Fireflies with bright ideas, and bats like jetting ambassadors, and the mantis like khaki police, and the furred caterpillars of judges, examining each case closely, and then, in the dark airs of ferns, and in the salt chuckle of rocks, with their sea pools, there was a sound like a rumor without any echo of history really beginning. Analysis. The poem explores several themes such as colonialism, culture, and oppression. This is mainly achieved through the use of imagery, irony, biblical allusion, which we will analyze stanza by stanza. The first stanza of the poem asks the Caribbean people for their statues, monuments, history, proof of their past existence. The writer then answers his own question by saying that they are in the sea. The sea has locked them up. It could be assumed that the author is talking about the history of the Caribbean being thrown overboard, drowned or sunk as a result of the perilous journey through the Middle Passage. In the second stanza, the author uses imagery and biblical allusion to liken the transatlantic journey the enslaved Africans took to important events in the Bible. He uses the term Genesis to describe the ship used by the Europeans, possibly saying that prior to the ship arriving on African shores, there was no history of Africa. He then calls the journey itself, with the moaning cries of the passengers, Exodus, a book in the Bible that talks about the freedom of slavery under the guide of Moses for the people of Israel. This is the opposite of what Wolcott describes, however, as a biblical reference is to freedom, while the journey, he likens it to the poem, is one of enslavement. This stanza speaks on the lives lost during the journey through the Middle Passage. The enslaved Africans who were drowned or their remains thrown overboard after succumbing to diseases or starvation are now mixed with the corals in the sea, creating a new and beautiful mosaic. The fourth stanza implies that despite the deceased bodies of the enslaved Africans that have been thrown aboard, the sea still looks in vain for history and instead likens them to ornaments or jewelry. This can be the author saying that, like the ocean, history is fluid and ever changing, or that despite the suffering endured by those who made the journey through the Middle Passage, because there are no monuments, there is no history. The poem talks about the mournful songs of Babylonian bondage, which is another instance of biblical allusion, likening the experiences of the enslaved Africans to those of the enslaved Jewish people. In the fifth stanza, Walcott talks about the arrival of the colonists. Then came the men with eyes heavy as anchors, who sank without tombs. This can be determined as meaning that the eyes of the colonists were heavy with greed, and killed Africans without proper burial, without recognizing that these were people and their lives have been lost eternally. These colonists then went on to killing and destroying the ecosystem of Port Royal in Jamaica, which caused its sinking. The poet likens this to the swallowing of Jonah by the whale. This stanza attempts to answer the question posed in the last line of the previous stanza. But where is your Renaissance? The poet states that the history is locked in them sea sands, out there past the reef's moiling shelf. The poet goes on to offer a guide to the history himself. The seventh stanza continues with the narrative from the previous one, describing the city at the bottom of the ocean, where the history is. He states that the city is to Africans what cathedrals are to colonizers. He then compares Africa to the city of Gomorrah, a biblical place that became victim to God's wrath. The colonists killed and ate the animals and people of Africa, causing further lament and sadness for Africa. And while it shares similarities with Gomorrah, it is different because what happens to the African people is real and is history that is yet to be discovered. In this stanza, the author speaks about the homes and communities built by Africans being destroyed by the Europeans. The ninth stanza talks about the emancipation of the enslaved Africans. The term white sisters is used to describe Christianity, which was used as motivation to free Africans from their history and religion of superstitions and paganism. Like water evaporating in the sun, this soon faded and revealed the truth about what the purpose of the Europeans and the erasing of the African history, which, unlike that of the Christians, is not the same as their religion. The poet also speaks about the fact that Africa was a large country broken up into small pieces by colonists for selfish means. In the final stanza, the poem likens the introduction of several Western industries to that of insects and animals. This imagery can be the author using the 10 plagues sent to Egypt by God as a form of biblical illusion. The poet calls the politicians frogs bellowing for a vote. Thus, the creation of political parties by Africans to force out the Europeans is looked at as the real beginning of history. Conclusion. To conclude, The Seer's History by Derek Walcott uses heavily biblical allusion to bring across the author's point of view on the history of the African people and the experiences of slavery.